Hey, welcome to the Bradford Hill criteria bonus episode. If you're here, you probably just heard the pre-roll from episode 5. And if you didn't, go back and listen to episode 5 first. Seriously, this will make a lot more sense. Because episode 5 with Dr. Comstock was the final argument. What you heard there was a focused, cleaned up version of a much longer process. But behind that episode were actually two separate conversations I had with Dr. Comstock. In the first conversation, we walked step by step through the Bradford Hill criteria, using it to poke holes in the idea that Morels were the cause of this outbreak. Then I went back, and anywhere where we had major issues, I did some more research, and we came back for a second conversation, this time trying to address those larger gaps. Episode 5, the trial of the Morel mushroom data, is what happens when you take both of those conversations and distill them down to the strongest points. But this episode is the full investigation, because understanding how we got there and, more importantly, how we used a causation framework to break down competing explanations is actually the valuable part. So that's what this episode is about. I'm going to give you a brief explanation, actually Dr. Ye will, about what the Bradford Hill criteria are. And then you're going to hear the complete unfiltered conversation between myself and Dr. Comstock as we apply each one of those criteria to the Morel mushroom. Now, this is an incredibly useful public health tool, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to share it. But it didn't just show up here. It's actually been sitting underneath this entire story. If you remember back to my conversation with Dr. Spencer, this actually came up when we were talking about his work linking cycad exposures to ALS in Guam and the similar hypothesis he had in Mont Chavon.
The Bradford Hill criteria nowadays are interpreted in the presence of experimental animal data. They support very strongly a link with BMAA, and because of a paucity of experiments done with causation, the strength is perhaps lower in that case.
Now, if you don't know what the Bradford Hill criteria are, I promise you are exactly where you're supposed to be. The Bradford Hill criteria are something called a causation framework. It's just 9 questions that you ask about a relationship between a cause and effect to see if it's really causation versus association. It's a pretty useful tool, but don't just take it from me.
Bradford Hill principles are one of the things that everybody learns in introductory epidemiology. Classically, the Bradford Hill criteria establish causation.
So these are super useful tools if you're trying to evaluate something like whether the cycad seed is the cause of ALS or just associated with it. And they help us avoid assigning blame to things that are just associations, like in the Gambia, when a bunch of children had fevers that were associated with kidney injury. But we found out the cause of the kidney injury was the diethylene glycol in their contaminated cough medicine. So the Bradford Hill criteria are basically 9 different questions you can ask about the relationship between a possible cause, like the cycad seed, and an effect like ALS. The questions are pretty straightforward. How strong is the relationship? Did the cause come before the effect? Is there experimental evidence that supports this kind of thing? Is there a dose response? Does it make biologic sense that this could even happen? There's 9 total, and I won't run you through each one of them. And while it's a great structured way to assess cause and effect, it is not a score. Dr. Ye from the CDC explains it well.
The criteria are important to consider, but we don't use them blindly as a checklist to establish causation.
So there's no minimum amount of these criteria you need to reach for it to undeniably be causation. The more of the criteria that you meet, it's probably more likely this is true causation. But that's not really what I think it's useful for. The most important part is looking for criteria that it doesn't meet. If a few of these criteria completely fall apart, it may be a sign you're barking up the wrong tree. And I've actually used this very same criteria to help us narrow in on a toxin during a huge outbreak. If you remember back to our earlier episodes, I mentioned one of the outbreaks I was actually in. All those young kids getting lung injury from vaping called EVALI. Well, during that outbreak, there were dozens of ideas about what inside these vapes could be causing all this damage in kids. Coconut oil or limonene or vitamin E acetate. How do you even start to figure out the cause? Well, we actually applied the Bradford Hill criteria to vitamin E acetate to help us figure out if this toxin lined up as the cause or if we needed to go looking at the others. And it helped us find a lot of other areas we needed to look at before we could land on vitamin E acetate. So whether you're trying to find a toxic vape poison or figure out if a plant in Guam is the cause of massive rates of ALS, these criteria help us systematically figure out if we are looking in the right direction for a poisoning outbreak. So if we really want to ask the question if Morels caused this outbreak, we need to take this data and put it through the lens of something like the Bradford Hill criteria. The same causation criteria people used to see if Peter Spencer's data held up to snuff when he tried to prove the cycad caused ALS in Guam, and the same criteria I used when investigating what toxins could be the culprit for the e-cigarette and vape-associated lung injury outbreak. If we hold this Morel data up to the light of the causation criteria, maybe we can see if there's some holes that need to be explored. And that is exactly what I did with Dr. Comstock. We took the CDC report and ran it through the Bradford Hill criteria, each one. And that's the conversation you're about to hear. After that conversation, we pared down to the most important topics that we needed to address and recorded that combo. That's episode 5. But so you can see how we applied the Bradford Hill criteria to narrow in on what we thought the biggest gaps were that needed to be evaluated. Take a listen to this full conversation. So I think we need to spend some time here and really try to assess the causation potential of this mushroom culprit. And with that, we've both read the CDC MMWR report about the Bozeman, Montana outbreak of severe gastrointestinal illness linked to a sushi roll that served morel mushrooms in it. And we're going to try to hold that data up to an objective framework. And Dr. Comstock, are you familiar with the Bradford Hill criteria?
I am. This was presented to me during my medical toxicology fellowship, but my understanding, if I'm remembering correctly, is that this was a list of criteria that were utilized that helped to link causally tobacco use with lung cancer back in, I believe, the 1950s, if I'm not mistaken, and have subsequently been used as a gold standard model for causality for epidemiologic linkage between exposure and outcome. And so the perfect framework to be utilizing here. Was it something like, is that correct? I don't.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's just a list of thoughts. It's not,
it's a framework to think about something. It's not even a score.
Right. Right.
You can't say, I got 8 points. This is causation. It's a framework that will help us think through whether or not there are some gaps in this cause-effect relationship. And importantly, if we can find gaps that we can't explain, then maybe there is something else we need to be evaluating beyond the morel mushroom. Or it will at least help us identify the areas of research that are needed to actually prove that this is the cause. So there's 9 criteria.
I can't wait.
The first criteria that we need to look at is strength of the association. So a high relative risk or odds ratio of an event occurring after exposure is more likely to suggest causation than, say, a weak one. That kind of makes sense. The stronger the relationship, if 100% of people exposed develop the illness, that's certainly very strong. This is what the investigators had to say. So they served a sushi roll. The sushi had rice, salmon, morel mushroom, and a variety of other things in it, wasabi. But they broke down all those ingredients, and this is what they found.
Patrons who got sick. were more than 10 times more likely to have eaten any morel mushrooms at the restaurant compared to those who did not get sick.
Were there any other foods that you picked up an association on?
So really nothing else stood out as clearly as the morel mushrooms.
So they found a tenfold, at least, increased odds of having eaten a morel mushroom if you were a patient who became sick. I hate the way they phrase that. It seems to make more sense to me that tenfold odd of getting sick if you ate a morel mushroom, but that's not the same thing. They didn't see it with other foods. So what do you think? Is that a strong association?
It's a big number. And in face value, it is compelling. How believable is the number itself? And that's not a comment on the investigators or the study. It's a comment on case controls. In that these interviews happened weeks after the exposures.
Right.
And what you're relying on is their recall of what they had at dinner weeks, if not a month ago, which I know were that to be offered to me, the validity of what I would say I've eaten about a week or a month ago would be low. And so I wonder about their ability to recall.
Hold on. Wait, what did you eat for lunch 4 days ago?
So this is a good week to ask me that question because it's unquestionably going to have been an Uncrustable in in an emergency department. So most weeks I'm unable to answer that question, but I can say with confidence that it was an Uncrustable and probably some baby carrots.
Okay, but you're saying recall bias.
Yeah. A morel is an odd thing to eat in a sushi roll. And I think you're much more likely to remember having eaten a morel than any other thing that may have been present in this sushi roll. And so maybe leads to that number being inflated. And to their credit, they bring this up very specifically amongst their limitations that those who got sick perhaps had a better degree of recall of eating this morel mushroom. At the end of the day, again, it's a big number, but I think it needs to be interpreted with the caveat that that number is probably subject to some significant bias.
Yeah, you're bringing up some great points. It's certainly possible that people who ate morels and didn't get sick didn't remember they had one, right? And it's certainly possible that people who did eat morels and remembered they ate it might over-respond that they got some nausea or something like that, right? If you've heard about this in the news and it's in the zeitgeist, it can absolutely influence the way you would respond to that survey. So I think those are great points to pick up. But they didn't see this trend with anything else, and I think that's at least a point in the favor for the morel mushroom as a vector. Whether it's the morel itself, I guess a different question. So let's go on to the next item we have here.
So temporality, looking for a clear timing of exposure and observed effect.
Yeah, so cause comes before the effect. This one, they had a pretty clear relationship. Patients pretty rapidly developed nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea within median time of 1 hour of gastrointestinal symptoms. Now, the range was a little bit long, and I think that's going to play into things later. They said as long as 92 hours, I think, was the range in some of this. But nobody was reporting symptoms beforehand. I don't know if there's much to argue about with this one. Temporality, I think it meets.
Agreed.
Okay, the next one. Every toxicologist's favorite Bradford Hill criteria, biologic gradient, which is the dose-response relationship. The dose makes the poison, right? So let's take a look at what our investigators had to say.
Now, the amount of the various foods consumed was also important for us to establish whether there might be a dose-response relationship. When you model the amount of the special sushi roll consumed as a continuous variable, we saw a positive association between a one-piece increase in consumption and case status in all the models that we ran.
Meaning that the more pieces of the special sushi roll that someone ate, the more likely they were to develop illness.
So they found that every extra piece of morel mushroom sushi roll you ate increased your odds ratio of being classified as one of the people who got sick. What do you think?
I love this component of the study. I think this is a boon for their ability to at least sway me to thinking that there's some plausibility here. And also, just sometimes when you read a study, you just kind of tip your cap to researchers and say, you guys are pretty smart and you did a pretty thoughtful job of thinking through this. I think they do a nice job of giving you these gradations, this 1 to 3 rolls compared to more than 4. And then there's this odds with every additional piece of sushi, you've got a 2-fold increase or a 5-fold increase with one of these models. It's a fun stat to look at, and I think it adds some weight to their case.
Absolutely. So yeah, it appears for whatever reason, 4 seemed to be the big hitter. If you had 4 or more rolls, that's when you really started to get sick. But each additional piece seemed to play a role. Okay. Well, I think that, those 3, it definitely meets, I think. Strength of association, temporality, biologic gradient, they're all pretty clear. But there are a few criteria where the morel mushroom just doesn't fit as the cause of this outbreak. And if we can't find a good explanation for why it's not fitting, we probably need to consider other sources as the cause of the outbreak.
Yes, I agree with you. Yeah, next one to consider would be plausibility, so that this association is biologically or scientifically reasonable based on our existing knowledge.
I mean, I guess, is it biologically plausible that mushrooms have poisons? Absolutely. Is it biologically plausible and scientifically reasonable that a mushroom could wait 2,025 years to tell the humans that are eating them that it's poisonous? That seems odd to me.
This is why I raised an eyebrow and scoffed when during that case, I think this is what to me is going to remain the biggest sticking point, is that you have millennia of consumption of this mushroom where certainly occasionally people get sick with foodborne illness, but it's not until now that we're recognizing that the morel itself was innately the culprit. So that part for me is a large hurdle to clear.
But I do think there's a couple of, I guess, explanations. Number one is a knowledge deficit in those who are perceiving this to be a new phenomenon, aka me, you, and everyone else who I've talked to, who when I say a morel is poisonous, they kind of go, what? But not all of medical history kind of stays in the zeitgeist. There may have been older reports in early medicine that have reported things like this. Not to mention our understanding of mushroom poisoning now is often based off what people believe were the mushroom they ate and reported, and how many false morels were actually false morels. What if some of those were true morels and we simply assigned them to be false morels because, we said, well, the false morels are the poisonous ones, right?
Certainly.
And the other thing I think is interesting is there's changes to the ecology of the world, and if morels are being created a different way or cultivated in a different way, that could maybe have an impact on the types of proteins they express or soil contaminants that they absorb. So it's possible that the morel is just a vector for some other toxin, but maybe there's a gap in our knowledge from medical literature that hasn't been filled in recent years. Or maybe they're actually expressing a new toxin due to environmental conditions.
Sure. If we're invoking the idea of some degree of genetic drift, that the morel is not the morel of old, I think that's fun to opine on and think about. And perhaps, again, we're talking about plausibility. Is it plausible? Certainly, I would counter argue that there are just more plausible reasons to come up with these 50 some odd patients developing gastrointestinal illness, particularly when in this case series or this case control study, they do document that the food safety analysis uncovered numerous food safety violations in this restaurant. Now, I know you have other data that maybe says this was not some alternate food safety etiology for their GI illness, but these morels did not come out of the autoclave and directly onto the plate. Right. So I come up with other potentially more plausible explanations for their illness.
Yeah, which would be bacterial foodborne illness. Right. And I agree. The possibility of genetic morel mutants suddenly becoming poisonous is far less likely than a bacterial poisoning outbreak, or even changes in ecology leading to different bacteria vector maybe a bacteria never associated with the Morel before. But can I share with you then, here is the testing that they did. They sent the Morel sample and human stool samples from affected patients to the CDC enteropathogen lab, as well as some FDA labs. They tested for Clostridia perfringens, Bacillus cereus, Staphylococcus, enterotoxin. They tested for E. coli. They tested for all of your typical enteropathogens, Salmonella. They even tested for cerulide, which is the Bacillus cereus emetic toxin. I mean, I feel like what the CDC has done here is even more extensive than anything we would ever do in the hospital, and they still failed to come up with a pathogen. So does that mean they ruled out every single pathogen? Maybe not, but it certainly seems to me like it's as extensive as it can get. And this would be one of the first times that they've come across an outbreak and not linked it with a pathogen that I know of. That's kind of why I feel like they've done a good job ruling it out. But I'm not an expert in every possible bacterial GE pathogen out there. So I don't know. It feels good to me. It feels like they did.
I agree with you. If they're taking this extensive look at all the more likely etiologies and finding nothing, I would lean on experts doing expert things, because this is far beyond my expertise when we're talking about comprehensive analysis for enteric pathogens. So you make a compelling point when they're as thoroughly evaluating for more common causes and coming away with nothing. For what it's worth, I like that explanation way more than this is just E. coli. I think that's the far more fun way to think about this. So I'm pro drift.
So, yeah. We touched a little bit on coherence, which is the next Bradford Hill criteria. The association fits with the existing theory and knowledge of what is currently known about this substance. That's why it seems not plausible, because it doesn't seem coherent that suddenly, after thousands of years of eating this mushroom, people are getting sick. And why weren't they getting sick more commonly before this? And we talked about several explanations for that already, genetic drift, medical literature knowledge gaps, etc. So no need to belabor that point again. Let's actually talk about another finding. This is objective data. They screened patients as objectively as they could and said, did you get sick? And what did you eat? And there's this criteria in the Bradford Hill called specificity, which is one cause, one effect. So if the Morel was the cause of the outbreak, everyone who developed symptoms should have eaten a Morel. Except in their very own data, 5 of the 41 patients who got sick did not eat a Morel. So what happened to them? And I bring that up because I think that's the first thing that would jump to my mind is, well, okay, I think we're barking up the wrong tree. But I do think they provide some interesting explanation. So let's hear what they say. Hey, it's Ryan, and I'm popping in here to actually tell you this criteria is not on this bonus episode because you heard it live in episode 5. This is the one we decided was explainable because the CDC and the public health teams didn't know exactly what toxicity looked like. So they cast a really wide net and included anyone who developed symptoms at any time after eating at the restaurant, and probably over-included some cases. Dr. Comstock in that episode pointed out that this also happened in EVALI, and he was right. Dr. Stanton and I actually wrote a paper together applying the Bradford Hill criteria to some of the highest suspected toxins to see if we could find one that was a clear source. And this issue of some people being labeled as sick when it's unclear they were sick from the exposure came up there too. So I want to play a clip here because it's very relevant to what appears to be outbreaks in general when it's to a somewhat unknown toxin.
And we saw a similar issue with EVALI and people who only use nicotine vape. Early on in the outbreak, there was a intense focus on vitamin E acetate because it was found in many of the vaping cartridges, although not all of them.
Right. When the CDC was collecting cases, they cast a really wide net. anyone who had vaped in the last 90 days and developed lung symptoms that weren't clearly infectious was counted as a case. And a lot of people can get lung things for many reasons. Now, later on, we kind of honed in on the culprit being vitamin E acetate, which is a cutting agent only used in THC vapes. But we had all these nicotine cases. And it's probably that all those nicotine vape cases were other conditions that were happening all along in the background, and we just swept up once we started looking for EVALI. It's the trade-off you make when you're trying not to miss anything in a novel outbreak.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, thanks for humoring this little detour. But I do think it's relevant to the outbreak at hand and interesting how this problem crops up in multiple outbreaks when you're trying to characterize a toxicity you've not really dealt with before. But let's get back to Dr. Comstock and the rest of our Bradford Hill criteria. But that brings us also to another limitation of the study, and one that I just almost can't get over, but I'm getting closer. So the 8th Bradford Hill criteria, consistency. The association is observed repeatedly across different studies, populations, and circumstances. Well, obviously, you and I have both come to the agreement this is not consistent with what our understanding of the historical consumption of Morels are, at least as far as we know. But even in this objective study, 10 of the patients in the control group consumed Morels and did not get sick. 10 patients.
Right.
What is going on with these 10 patients that they can have a sushi roll and they don't have any issues, but everyone else gets ill? So that's what I was grappling with.
Yeah, the point that I would bring up, I think, is the point that you're about to bring up.
Ryan again, and we're going to skip this criteria too because you already heard it. We talked at length about how the preparation of the Morels and the dose of Morels consumed probably influenced who got sick. This was also in the original episode 5. So head there if you want to hear how we dealt with the consistency criteria.
That would be 3 patients who didn't get sick, ate raw Morels, as compared to 20 who did get sick, ate raw Morels. And so this is where they have a odds ratio of close to 100 on that specific date as compared to a much lower odds ratio on April 8th.
That's pretty strong.
It is.
I think that's a unique finding that does tie a lot of this together. And I do also have an explanation for why those 3 people who ate the raw Morels didn't get sick.
Some people are indeed able to eat these mushrooms without any adverse effects. But then suddenly, perhaps in later life, they become ill. We do not know the explanation for that. The issue is, are some people susceptible more than others to these toxins? People have an enzyme system which controls the rate of metabolism of a hydrazine-like drug.
It gets rid of the monomethylhydrazine. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Essentially, a faster metabolizer will have reduced exposure to monomethylhydrazine, and a slower metabolizer will have more exposure for the same given dose.
That's right. So in those who are slow acetylators, monomethylhydrazine hangs around longer.
So in your study, how many of the people who developed ALS appeared to be slow acetylators?
Oh, it was a very, very small majority were slow or intermediate acetylators. That is consistent with the idea, but I wouldn't take it as firm evidence.
Right.
It was just a trend.
So Dr. Comstock, I could see you with multiple raised eyebrows. That was not about Morels. That was Dr. Peter Spencer, who's a neurotoxicologist, who helped link false Morels to an outbreak of ALS in France. And one of their hypotheses there was that some people were more susceptible to ALS because they believe monomethylhydrazine damaged the DNA, and if you were a slow metabolizer, it hung around longer and you were more likely to get it. That's not necessarily relevant here, but what it does bring up is that not only have past mushroom poisoning outbreaks shown a genetic predeterminance to toxicity, but patient factors play a role. So the people who got very ill in the CDC report, they mentioned they had underlying comorbid conditions that might influence their fragility in terms of being able to tolerate any given mushroom poisoning or any poisoning, particularly this. So when you look at any given mushroom poisoning, there are 7 different levers you can pull to change the outcome. And 2 of those are your past medical conditions that influence your fragility and your predetermined genetics that influence your sensitivity to the toxin. We don't know what this is, but it's possible there's a genetic variant that prevents a toxin from being absorbed or etc. So there are at least plausible reasons why some people might have tolerated things more.
Oh, I'm sold. This is not a part that needs to be particularly sold. We're talking 3 out of 23 who consumed the mushrooms on the more at-risk date. I'm not fast enough at math. It's some low number or low percentage of people who did not get sick after consuming the Morel on that day. I don't think of any exposure or any disease state as having 100% penetrance as far as creating that phenotype. And so the idea that some people came through unscathed, I don't look at it as a significant hurdle to finding plausibility or believability for Morel as a potential toxic mushroom.
The next big one is experimental evidence, such as randomized trials supporting this association. And this is kind of the big question for me. Until I read this CDC MMWR report, not a drop of evidence has ever come across my plate for Morels being toxic.
Agreed. And I think this is why this will continue to remain a question mark, in that the highest quality evidence that we're looking at is albeit well done, it's a case control study. And so something more robust, I think, would really, of course, strengthen this conversation. Until then, it's going to remain a bit of a mystery.
Yeah, I mean, part of the Bradford Hill criteria is identifying where more research is needed. A mouse study of feeding morels to a creature and reproducing this toxicity, looking at different preparation methods of the morel to see if it impacts this reproducible syndrome, identifying a toxic compound, or maybe a genetic analysis of past and pre-morels. I don't know if they can do that. I'm probably oversimplifying, but there is just nothing out there because I think for the very first time, the scientific community is even getting the signal that they should shine a light at this. So we'll have to see what comes up. But the lack of evidence, that kind of jumps us to our next criteria too. Well, I think that takes us through all 9 of our Bradford Hill criteria.
One more.
Analogy.
Are
there similar exposures? We know mushrooms are poisonous, but newly poisonous? I'm actually not going to play you this part of the conversation because, well, we didn't have a great analogy for this section, although Grant did bring up the blue-ringed octopus. I did eventually find some stronger analogies about mushrooms growing new toxicities, but you already listened to that. So that'll take us to the end of this episode. That was all 9 of the Bradford Hill criteria, the different facets of which you can examine a relationship between an exposure and an effect. Strength of association, consistency, specificity, temporality, biologic gradient, plausibility, coherence, experimental data, and analogy. And what you heard wasn't a textbook explanation. It was an example of how it can be used in practice to identify areas that need further analysis to help prove causation or refute it. When you're staring at a real-world problem with multiple possible culprits, no clear toxin, and incomplete data, this is one of the ways we work through it. Not by checking boxes, but by stress testing the idea from every angle and looking for where it breaks. Because in toxicology and public health, the goal isn't just to find an answer, it's to make sure you're not convincing yourself of the wrong one. Thanks for listening along. I hope you learned something from this whole experience, and we'll see you on the next episode of The Morel Dilemma.